All right, so in our department, we're demographers. A lot of us are demographers, and we really care about population and the environment issues. And so this is one of my favorite topics. Gosh, that's all I can really say. I know that many of you care about population and environment issues, and especially are concerned about whether we're experiencing global climate instability and whether we can mitigate its effects. And so this is what this chapter is about. And so in this chapter, I'm going to talk to you about how demographers look at population issues and look at environment issues. And we'll look at some specific examples. So I'll be addressing demography in the United States and how we use the census. I'll be talking about the three basic demographic processes that demographers study. And we'll talk about population characteristics, urbanization, and ecology and environment. And we'll especially look at population and environment in the 21st century. So when we think about the U.S. population, we know that on Earth right now there's about 7 billion people. 2011 was the year that we reached 7 billion. And later on I'll talk to you about demographers' predictions about how many people will be the maximum size of the population when we finally start growing. But each year the world's population is in fact growing. We haven't reached stability yet, a stationary population. In the United States right now, we have 318.9 million people, and that our population has more than doubled since 1946. In 1946, we were at about 132 million people, and so we've seen a real growth. And in fact, we're still growing, but it seems as though that we're really growing because of lingering effects of immigration and the facts that the immigrants have slightly higher fertility rates than our native-born population. All right, so when I talk to you about demography, what I mean is the scientific study of the current state and changes over time in the size, composition, and distribution of populations. They were really interested in population dynamics. And a census is a head count of the entire population of a country, and it's usually done at regular intervals. And so in the United States, we do it every 10 years, where we're trying to count every single person in the United States. That's as compared to vital statistics, which is another form of data where you are tracking people's births, like through birth certificates, marriages through marriage certificates, death through death certificates, and that we look at migrations in and out of the country. We keep looking at administrative records on that. And that basically we look at any administrative record that might kind of quantify what populations are doing, right? So I think that's really interesting. So I know, for example, my family went to Ellis Island to look up which of our family members had passed through Ellis Island to migrate. And my family is really active with Ancestry.com now. We're pursuing our family tree. And we think it's fascinating when it offers up documents about migration records and which ships our family members were traveling on. So that's kind of vital statistics information. Another way demographers get information is through surveys. That we do surveys of populations, which is a little bit different than censuses. So the basic three demographic processes that demographers care about are births, deaths, and migrations. When people are born, when they die, and how they move, where they move while they're alive. And so what I think is really interesting is if you look at global population, you truly are living in interesting times. And so, for example, throughout human history, we were at relatively low levels of population. And so that didn't mean that we were always just at a very few people. It meant that sometimes we were able to amass concentrations and large numbers of populations, but then they might experience a war or a conflict about getting food or some sort of illness that wiped them out. And so for the first, up until 1800, 1800 is the first time we had 1 billion people on Earth. So that was about 1804. And then 123 years later, we got the second billion in 1927. And then what you started to see is that we started to accelerate rapidly. And so in 32 years, in 1959, we had 3 billion people on Earth. 15 years later, in 1974, we had 4 billion. 13 years later, in 1987, 5 billion. 12 years later, in 1999, 6 billion. 2012, 13 years later, is 7 billion. And that we're expected, to keep on in this rate of 13 years or so until we start getting a little bit longer. So in 2043, it'll start being like 17 years before we add another billion. And so what I'd like to point out to you is that since the 1970s, we've started seeing 1 billion people added on Earth every 13 years or so. And so that's an astonishing amount of growth. And so if you pictured human population growth, this is a really good depiction of it. And so it's looking at year 0 through the year 1000, 1500, the year 2000, and then 2016, which is right around us, like last year. And it shows you that most of the world's population is pretty flat until in 1500 it starts increasing a little, and then in 1804 you start seeing an increase. And then suddenly you look at it and it looks almost like it's an exponential growth, right? It looks like it's kind of radically doubling very, very rapidly, right? And so this has all been an enormously concentrated time in human history. And so that's why it's interesting to think through how much population can the world sustain, and what are the consequences of having such a high population, a high number of people on the world's resources. So other ways that we look at population is sometimes through sex ratios, and that's the number of males per 100 females that are born. A sex ratio above 100 means that there are more males than females in the population, and if it's below 100, it means there are more females than males. In the United States, there are about 105 males born for every 100 females, and so the sex ratio is about 105. And they think that in the United States, where our health generally is okay, and our access to nutrition is pretty okay, that might actually be showing kind of a biologic predisposition to have a slightly larger number of boys born than girls, because boys end up being less thrifty, that they're a little bit more likely to die at younger ages and a little bit more likely to die at the higher risk ages in their teen years. And so this is a way of kind of assuring genetically that we'll have a relatively equal numbers of proportions when they reach adulthood, right? So that's one of the arguments for it. But it is interesting that this ratio kind of varies around the world. Sometimes it varies for unknown reasons, but mostly it varies for very well-known reasons. So in China, for example, because of the sex preferences against girls, the sex ratios are really uneven. I have that wrong. I written wrong there. That what we see is that there's a boy preference for religious reasons, for their Confucian religious practices. They would prefer to make sure that they have a boy born into their family. And so what you're seeing is that there are 125 boys born for every 100 girls. And so we know that they're clearly using perhaps ultrasound to use sex-selective abortion procedures. Sometimes it might be infanticide or child abandonment, but they're really trying to make sure that they have more boys than girls. This unbalanced sex ratio can be even higher at a higher order parities. And so in China, they've released their one-child policy, and they're letting people have like 2 children. And so if you're a young couple and your first baby girl is a girl, you might say, okay, that's fine, we want a boy and a girl, and so we'll just make sure we have a boy for our second child. And so what they're showing is that for second births, this sex ratio is even higher, that people are really diligently using ultrasound, and that sometimes that sex ratio in some provinces of China can approach something like 1,000 boys being born for every 100 girls in the second birth order. So we're looking at real inequalities. India is another country that still has kind of imbalanced sex ratios. All right, one way that demographers like to look at populations is through age-sex pyramids. And so this is looking at the United States, that kind of drawing, that purple and gray drawing on the left, and Mexico is on the right, and it's showing them for the year 2000, so there's census information. And that is showing you population across age. So you can see people on the column. So people under age 5 to 9, age 10 to 14, and at the top, people age 85 and older. The purple is men, and the gray is women, right? And so it's showing you the percentage of the population. And so you can see that these age-sex pyramids look very, very different from each other. And in fact, in the United States, it doesn't even look like a pyramid at all. It almost looks like the tip of a pencil. And so you can see that it looks like there's more people in the kind of youngish adult ages, right? And there are more children than older ages. But in general, it looks like the population is kind of evenly distributed across these categories. And that maybe the highest category is those who are 30 to 34, and they're about 6% of the population. Mexico looks totally different, right? And so here you see that 18% of the entire population of men is under age 5. The next highest group is about 16% of the population, and those are boys that are age 5 to 9. And then the next highest is 10 to 14. And then you can see that there's extraordinarily few people who are of older ages, and so few that are 85 and older that they aren't even picked up on this pyramid. And that this one actually really looks like a pyramid. If you looked at these, you would bet that you would be very certain that Mexico is growing at a faster rate than the United States, right? that you would look at that and realize that, God, they have a lot more younger children or younger percentage of the population than we do, and that these young people are going to grow up and have more young people of their own. And so this is kind of a pyramid that really has a lot of growth potential to it. And so people can learn a lot by looking at how populations are distributed by age and gender. For example, if we were looking at Russia, at the start of the 20th century, we would see in the young adult ages that for on the men's side, there would be these enormous kind of like almost like bites taken out of it. And that on the women's side in young adult ages, there would be far more young women at young adult ages than men. And that was because of civil conflicts and the early wars that men were dying at disproportionately higher rates, young men were. And so these kind of pyramids can give you lots of information. Another thing that we like to look at as demographers are cohorts. And a cohort consists of all the persons born within a given time period. So I was born in the cohort of all those babies that are born between 1960 and 1965. I was born in 1963. You can also have cohorts that do things at the same time. And so there might be marriage cohorts, everybody who gets married this summer in June 2017, that kind of thing. And so what happens is that cohorts either remain the same size or they get smaller because of deaths, but they never grow larger. And so if you're in a birth cohort, it's not as though we're going to go back in time and have more people born into that cohort. And so it's interesting to watch what happens to a cohort over time. What is their life chances? How rapidly do they die? How rapidly do they go through changes? There you go. So now I want to talk to you kind of about Malthusian theory. So I would like you to think through how you feel about what's happening to Earth right now. So do you feel like things are pretty catastrophic and that we're facing dire circumstances and that greenhouse gases are really becoming difficulty, that we've reached a turning point and that we're going to see even worse conditions? So as the waters warm and ice caps melt, permafrost is going to release even more methane. Like, are you one of those people that sees that you don't feel as though there's much we can do to turn around these changes? Or are you feeling relatively positive? There was a man who was writing in this vein a long time ago. And so in the late 17th century, Thomas Malthus came along. And what he was is that he started out as a pastor, and he ended up getting the nickname Gloomy Parson because he was a very gloomy person. He really felt as though the world populations would always catastrophically fall apart. And so he ended up writing a book called Essays on Population. And in this book, he kind of wrote his theory that populations tend to grow faster than the subsistence needed to sustain that population. And that he argued that if you look at populations, they grow not arithmetically, like slowly, incrementally. Populations grow by exponential bounds. So 2 people can make 4, 4 people can make 8, 8 can make 16, 16, 32. And so exponential growth. And that when you look at the resources of the earth, they can only grow arithmetically. So if you're not getting enough crops, you might be able to put more water on the soil, like you might be able to irrigate. Maybe you can do better with fertilizers. Maybe you can develop new seeds. But every increase is going to be kind of an arithmetic improvement, a small improvement, rather than an exponential improvement. And so basically he says that when you look at humans, humans are always going to atavistically and selfishly end up consuming far more resources than their population can survive. And so from his point of view, he said that there's only kind of 2 checks on explosive population growth. And so one is what he calls positive checks. And by positive checks, he means war, famine, disease, epidemics, and pestilence. And so what he means is they will positively kill you. When you finally have eaten all the food in your community, you're going to start a war to try to steal other people's food. If you have eaten all of your food resources, you will experience famine and die. If you are malnourished, you will have diseases. There will be epidemics as you transmit the diseases. And so he talks about that, these positive checks that will wipe out large populations through death. And then there's negative checks. And by that he means you can curb people's access to marriage. You can reduce their starting of when they start families, that they might have fewer children that way. Remember that he's writing in the 1700s, right? And so he doesn't see birth control as part of this process. And in fact, he wouldn't, even if there was contraception that was easily readily available, he wouldn't want people to use it, right? And so he thinks that these negative checks won't work because he thinks they're only used, he's kind of a snob, by the upper classes. That the upper classes, they might have their children marry at later ages as they're trying to arrange marriages that will, accumulate wealth for their family, have advantaged marriages. But he argues that poor people have nothing, will have nothing, and so all they'll want to do is have sex and eat food, and surely they'll have babies and help with ruining the world's resources. Now, this is kind of how he wrote about it in the book, kind of gives you the language. He wrote, "Famine seems to be the last, the most dreadful resource of nature. The power of population is so superior to the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man, that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and able administrators of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction, and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in the war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence and plague advance in terrific array, and sweep off their thousands and 10,000s. Should success be still incomplete, giant, inevitable famine stalks in the rear, and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world." So what you need to know is that his ideas have had an enormous impact on policymakers' thinking. He wrote this in the 1700s, and he ended up earning the first chair in political economy because of it. He became very famous for this, and we're still kind of dealing with his ideas. And in fact, there's some people who look at him and they say they're neo-Malthusians. They call themselves new Malthusians. They say that he's right, but he was only talking about agriculture, about us surpassing our food resources. And so they say that he was more right than we can even know. That basically, if he knew how we were burning through non-renewable resources, like our water supply, like oil, how we're polluting the environment, he would be blown away at how his thesis is correct, right? And so there's some people who say that he was very, very right. But other people look at him and say, there's a reason he's called the gloomy parson. They say that, hey, he didn't foresee 3 revolutionary developments in his time period. He didn't realize that in agriculture we would really make technological advances, that we really are able to grow more food per acre, and that we seem less concerned about how much food we grow and more concerned about inequalities and how we distribute it, especially to deal with food shortages, food crises, and famine. And that he couldn't predict how we advance in medicine, and that we've been able to fight off the diseases that he more routinely saw wiping off populations in his historical record and in his time period. In fact, what you need to know about him is that he was writing his book during a time period when there was massive food shortages. And so there were potato famines in Ireland, and that people really were seeing blighted crops for a long period of time. It was a great concern. And then also, he didn't see a place for contraception as a part of the solution, but he didn't realize that the development of contraception would be able to keep the birth rate lower than he thought would ever be possible. And so, in fact, even in some of the most least developed parts of the world, we're seeing really dramatic drops in fertility, and that larger percentage of the population are not just accepting contraception, but pretty modernized and very effective forms of contraception. And so there's a big debate now. Some people are a little too Pollyanna, like too positive. So there's people who follow this economist named Julian Simon, and Julian Simon said the explosion in population growth since the 1960s, adding 1 billion people every 12 to 13 years, is a wonderful thing, because it means that, one, we are getting more and more potential for having more Mozarts, more geniuses, more Steve Jobs, and that these people will help us figure out how to live well on Earth, and that how to avoid famine and war and pandemic disease. And so there are the Julian Simons who have no concern about population growth and how we're using non-renewable resources. And then there's the Malthusians who feel like we are on the edge of extinction on this planet. And so I would ask you to think through, where would you place yourself on that continuum? So now I'm going to talk to you about another theory, demographic transition theory. So demographic transition theory, I learned this when I was back as an undergrad, and it's been my bread and butter kind of theory throughout my life as a demographer. It proposes that countries pass through a predictable and consistent sequence of population patterns that's linked to their technological development in their society. And what it ends up with is that at the end of this transition, they're going to be at low birth rates and low death rates. but that they start out with very high birth rates and very high death rates. And that the argument originally was that eventually population should stabilize, population on Earth, and that we would see that there would be low birth rates and low mortality rates, and our population on Earth would be really stable. We wouldn't have spikes in mortality or spikes in fertility, that we would just kind of stay the same size as a population. And so here's kind of a complicated graph showing that. And so if you kind of look from left to right, that very top kind of greenish line is the birth rate. So the number of births in the population, or the birth rate per thousand in the population. And then the second line is the death rate. And so you can see at the very left, there's a very high birth rate and very high death rate. And so population, you can see the population is the yellow line, is relatively low. And that's because even though there's an incredible number of babies being born, many of those babies are dying. And so there's very little population growth. So the argument is that what happens first is that the death rate starts falling. So we make improvements in agriculture. We start doing things like pasteurizing our milk so that it doesn't have bacteria in it. We learn about the germ theory of disease. So for example, Joseph Lister, he was this man who he thought, hey, when women come in to give birth in hospitals, doctors didn't really wash their hands. And so doctors may be doing autopsies or dealing with people who have infectious diseases and then birth the baby. And so many women were dying of puerperal fever, which is an infection from getting diseased tissue on their wounded tissue after birth, right? And so Joseph Lister said, hey, why don't we wash our hands and then dry them in lime so that before we touch patients? And that way we will maybe not transmit germs, right? So anyway, I'm giving you this example because slowly over the course of time, we make these changes that increase our chances of living and the death rate goes down. But people can't be sure that their own babies are going to live, right? And so the birth rate might still be high even though the death rate is going down. And so that's what you see in stage 2, that the death rate starts falling really rapidly. And so that little blue that's in between the birth rate line and the death rate line is the number of people who are born, who are living above and beyond, those that are dying. And so that's like surplus people. And that's when you start seeing that yellow line, total population, start increasing, right? The third stage is when the population starts realizing, hey, you know what? Our babies are living. We don't need to have 6 to 9 babies to make sure that enough babies make to adulthood. And so we can start reducing our fertility to start meeting the number of children we would like to have in old age. And so birth rate starts falling and you start seeing population increase start kind of responding as well. And so at the late stages of stage 4, you start seeing both lines converge again, right? And we thought originally that what would happen is that birth and death rates would be really equal at low ages or at low levels, that people would live for very long life expectancies and that they would have very few children, right? And so more or less that's what happened in the United States and other advanced industrial nations. If you look at other nations, they're a little bit farther back on the curve. So some countries are still at high birth rates and they're just starting to have low death rates. So for example, in Africa, during the 20th century, we started helping them with malaria. And so their death rate started to fall. But then in the mid-1980s, they got an HIV pandemic. And so their death rates went up again, right? So they're kind of in stage 2 rather than stage 4. But now what's happened is that a surprising thing happened. That for some nations, especially in Italy and Germany, France, even the United States, birth rates are consistently and long-term going below death rates. And so it looks like we're going to have population losses rather than population gains, and that we might have them at very significant levels. So for example, Japan is expected inside of a generation to lose 80 million people through death rates and the fact that their young people are not having babies. And so now we're actually kind of talking about what can we do to increase birth rates in some places of the world, and is it even possible? So anyway, that's kind of the demographic transition, going from high birth to high death to low birth and low death. So what are some of the possible next stages? Some people argue that, hey, we really are going to be in lowest low fertility, that people are going to be having very few births. And so like in Spain, women have 1.2 births per woman, which means that they're far below 2.1 births that are needed to replace the woman and the partner, right? And that the death rates are still slightly higher than the birth rates. And so some argue that we're going to go through an uncomfortable moment in history when world population might decline from its high, billions. Then we might go down. Others argue that we might have like fluctuations in world population, that there might be some periods when we have incredibly dramatically high death rates, but we still have low birth rates. So for example, those people who are really concerned about pandemic flu, pandemic diseases coming from the developing world into the developed world that wipe us out quickly. So like science fiction, like will we be wiped out in millions and billions of people? And so there's some people who argue that might be the case, especially since we're seeing that our antibiotics are not as effective, that we're seeing superbugs, super infections that are able to resist the common medical treatments that we're using, and that a lot more people are getting sick with diseases they didn't have when they're going into hospitals than in the past. And then others argue that, hey, we're just seeing an interesting moment in history. It's not particularly alarming, it's just what is happening. And so they say that for some places in the world, they're going to be in a prolonged second stage while they sort out their death rates, while they deal with pandemic disease, while they deal with inequalities and how we give medical treatment and food. And so they're going to have explosive population growth because they'll keep high fertility, but their death rates will be kind of fluctuating on a downward spiral. But that there's some places in the advanced developed countries where they really are going to maybe have periods of reduced population. And in fact, as a demographer, I know we're all kind of, as policymakers, concerned about like the movement of people from African nations like Syria pouring into to Europe, and about what kind of immigration that is when people from the Middle East and North Africa are immigrating to Europe. But when you look at it demographically, just demographically, Europe is an aging population, right? An enormous percentage of the population is 65 and older, and even 85 and older. And that people who are immigrating are of younger ages and have higher fertility rates. And so what you might be seeing is kind of a rejuvenation of a population, that younger people may move in and help the older people, and especially in countries that are expected to have declining populations overall. So that's one way of looking at it. Now let's specifically look at ecology and the environment. So this human ecology is the study of the interdependencies between humans and our physical environment. And I imagine that a lot of you are human ecologists by heart. A human ecosystem is any system of interdependent parts that involves human beings in interaction with one another and the physical environment. So even living in an urban ecosystem. So for example, I grow food in my backyard. I try not to use chemicals on my lawn because I don't want to impact robins and other birds that use the soil to get worms and bugs. I try to use permaculture. I don't want to use chemicals in my home garden. I try to move over my garden and my grass to more native plantings over time. I'm kind of an ecosystem overall. I know the squirrels that are in my yard each day. So that's kind of an ecosystem, a really simple one, but I'm kind of describing. So what we see now is that there's two fundamental problems that are presenting our present ecosystems. One is, in some regions of the world, not all, we really are facing problems of overpopulation. And then also we're seeing the destruction or exhaustion of natural resources, and so non-renewable resources, and at relatively high rates. And so I know that even over the course of me preparing these lectures for you, there's been a lot of scientific evidence to suggest that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia has been permanently damaged and that the majority of it is maybe dead already. And so that's an example. So when we talk about overpopulation, we're often talking about not just total numbers of people, but population density. And so population density is the total number of people per unit of area, usually per square mile. And so a lot of people are interested in population density because they argue that, hey, the more dense you have, the more people per mile, you have higher rates of crime and homelessness, air and water pollution problems, greater problems with acid rain and hazardous wastes. Other people argue that maybe population density isn't the problem. It's how we organize our human relations. And so they argue that, yeah, maybe urban centers are now kind of heat centers and global CO2 emitters, but that we can do better. So for example, we can make green roofs. We can become more efficient in how we transport products, that we become more energy efficient, and that we won't waste as much fuel transporting progress or products to people who are more widely distributed. And so population density will become a really important issue for urban planners, urban policymakers. So let's think about urbanization. 90% of the future population growth on Earth by 2020 and then even beyond, so even just a few years from now and beyond, is going to be in less developed nations. And so when we think about population growth, we're not talking about the Europes of the world or the United States or Australia. We're talking about developing nations. We're talking about Nigeria, Somalia, Indonesia. In 2015, 500 metropolitan areas have 1 million or more people. Mainland China has 105 metropolitan areas with over 1 million people in them, with over 1 million people each. And so, I know you can name a lot of large cities, but just think about it. There are hundreds of them in the world that we don't even really know the names of on a routine daily basis. And that what we've seen is that there's even been the growth of megacities. That's been increasing even faster than congregations of over 1 million people. For example, in 2016, Tokyo, Japan has 38 million citizens, and Delhi, India has 25 million. And that China is experiencing really major problems with this, with rapid urbanization. They're having extraordinarily high levels of air pollution and problems with getting water for their urban residents. And so what's interesting is that as they're starting to develop a middle class, they want not necessarily new cars, they want used cars. And so the research is showing that in some of their largest cities, there's a 30,000 new cars per year that are added, not per year, I'm sorry, let me state that again. That in some of their major cities, like Beijing and Shanghai, there are over 30,000 new cars per month added to the roads, and that's not even including the new used cars that people are purchasing. And so air pollution is becoming a critical problem in China. Okay, so I want to talk to you about a specific problem and then tell you a story about a great American woman. So if you're thinking about this pollution that's created from factories, from our polluting processes, you might be interested in organogenesis. And organogenesis is the in utero development of our organs, limbs, and brains. And so it's really miraculous. So we're talking about stem cells. That in human fetuses, we have these cells that are incredibly plastic and flexible and willing to become anything, right? And so at certain stages of our development, they might become our fingers, they might become our eyes, they might be encouraged to become our brains and our nervous systems, right? They're extraordinarily important to our development, these flexible cells. And that they're also really susceptible to the environment. And so you can really have a consequence on fetal development if you interrupt stem cell growth, right? And so biologists and ecologists are really concerned about our generational increase in the pollutants that we're putting in the world, the toxins that we're putting in the world in our food chain. And that, in fact, a lot of biologists talk about the food chain as not just humans at the top of the food chain, which I'm sure you heard of, but they think of it as the human fetus at the top of the food chain. Because a human fetus, it takes nourishment from its mother, right? And so whatever the mother passes through the placenta or passes through her breast milk is concentrated into her infant. And that a lot of research is really clear that by nursing an infant, their body is being leached of the pollution that's been stored in their fat cells. And so that mothers who are breastfeeding their children are often putting their extraordinary levels of toxins into their fetus. And you can imagine, obviously, mothers would never want to do that, right? And so biologists are looking at how we are concentrating pollutions in different places in the world and in human bodies, and how this might not be fairly distributed around the world. So, for example, factory production of pollution in the U.S. might show up in people's bodies or environment in Africa, for example. And so we're kind of looking at the politics of that. If you're interested in this topic, you should read Sandra Steingraber's book. She's this political activist. She's been arrested multiple times. She's really against fracking, that kind of thing. But in 2001, she wrote a book called Having Faith, An Ecologist's Journey to Motherhood. So she's an ecologist and a biologist. She has a PhD. She's a professor. And she wrote this book while she was pregnant with her first baby. And the baby was a girl who she named Faith. And so this book is kind of doing three things, really. It talks about her experiences in her pregnancy and what it was like. And then she also talks about, at each stage in her pregnancy, where is her fetus in terms of fetal in utero development, right? So she talks about what she considers to be the biological miracle occurring. And then she talks in scientific terms about great disasters to human populations because of pollution. So I'll give you an example of two. In Minamoto, Japan, for over 40 years, there was a population of fishermen who lived on a bay, and a factory came in, and over 40 years, the factory was putting mercury as part of their industrial process directly into the bay. And so fish were being born with mutations. It was really impacting their fish populations, and very rapidly, people were getting cancers, were becoming infertile, children were being born with genetic anomalies, and people were showing real neurological deficits. And mercury is profoundly toxic and damaging to our neural circuitry. And so that was like an instant where a population was profoundly and immediately impacted by a factory releasing pollutions, right? It was highly controversial. And what was controversial about it is that the population, they identified very rapidly that it was something that the factory was doing, and it took many decades to get the government to agree to restrict the release of mercury into the water supply. So that's one example. The other example I want to give you is in the United States. And so the woman I want to talk to you about is named Frances Kelsey Oldham. And so in 1931, she was a student in Vancouver, and she was fantastic at chemistry and pharmacology. And so her professors at McGill University told her, hey, you should go to Chicago. The University of Chicago is opening a new pharmacology program. And so she applied, and she had fantastic grades. So they accepted her because they thought she was a man. So they were surprised as all get out when Frances arrived, and Frances was a woman. But they let her stay. And so immediately in the next year, her research as a graduate student showed that this one solvent was causing deaths in humans. And so her work was so important, even as a graduate student, that it helped the Congress create the FDA's Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, okay, in 1938. And so she kept on doing important research. She was especially interested in drugs and chemicals and compounds that pass through the fetus, or no, not pass through the fetus, pass through the placenta. She had a lot of interest in kind of reproductive health as part of her pharmacological concerns. So jump forward in 1960. She gets hired by the FDA. She's done a lot of medical research. Now she's working for the Food and Drug Administration for the United States in 1960. So it's the first time a woman is hired, right? In her very first month, this company, Merrill Richardson, a pharmaceutical company, petitions the FDA in order to get permission to sell a new drug in the United States. They've already given over 2.5 million tablets of the drug to over 1,200 physicians in the United States as kind of like free samples, like, hey, here's our new drug. And that the drug is already legally being sold in Canada and 20 other European and African nations. But Frances Kelsey Oldham, she's an old school scientist, and she's been reading the medical journals. And she read in a British medical journal a study that suggested that the drug had kind of troubling effects on fetal development, and it looked like there was genetic development flaws, birth defects in babies. And so she said, hold on, I'm not going to issue you a license. I'm not going to give you a permit to sell this drug. And so the pharmaceutical company went crazy. They petitioned her multiple times, and she kept on saying, show me the science. Show me your clinical trials. And they kept on refusing. And they went to the government, and they asked the federal government to have her fired. And the federal government put pressure on her, and she still refused. And so it turned out the next year, in 1961, it became really clear that tens of thousands of infants around the world, and especially in Germany, were being born with profound birth defects. And that children whose mothers had taken this drug during pregnancy, half those children didn't even survive, let alone being born with birth defects. And that drug was thalidomide. I don't know if you are probably too young to know about it, but it was a drug that was packaged to deal with nausea during pregnancy, but that one that's associated with children being born with enormous neurological deficits and then being born without arms or without legs, having really profound physical deficits as well. And so you can imagine, the country was pretty proud and happy of her then. And so in 1962, President Kennedy gave her an award for federal service, our highest award for federal service, and that the Congress passed a law that made it that companies, pharmaceutical companies, had to run clinical trials to prove that their drugs were safe, and that they had to report adverse effects. So they had to report things that were causing trouble with their drugs, that were causing harm to humans, and that they also had to get informed consent from patients. And so she's had an enormous impact on our understanding about organogenesis. And as a small sidebar, she lived to 101 years old and received nothing but props and kudos and thanks from everyone for it. And on her deathbed at 101, she was a Canadian citizen. The governor of the province that she lived in came to her deathbed to give her the highest order in the land. So this is a woman who was recognized for her science and service. All right, back to what we're doing. Let's look at the U.S. in global context. The United States represents 5% of the world's population, but we consume 25% of fossil fuels, 20% of metals, 33% of paper, and we produce 72% of the hazardous waste. And that when you think about us in combination with Western nations, like adding Europe and Australia, Westernized industrial nations account for 12% of the world's population, but 60% of consumption overall. And so when we think about what we want to do with global climate instability and the use of non-renewable resources and the pollution that we're putting into the world, we have to think about this disproportionate production by the advanced world and about how the developing world might feel about how they want to economically develop. Do they want to have the same trajectory for us, or are they going to be forced to be more resource conscious than we were, right? We know that this is an enormous political dialogue. Along with that, we see that there's enormous environmental racism and classism as well. And so research commonly shows from environmental sociologists that waste, industrial waste, nuclear waste, any kind of waste, medical waste, is dumped disproportionately in areas with high concentrations of minority groups, racial ethnic minorities. And the ethnic minority households tend to be closer to toxic waste sites, even when you consider households of comparable low-income status. And so it really looks as though urban planners, policy planners, are choosing not just to put it in poor neighborhoods, but in poor Black or poor minority neighborhoods. And that's kind of an ongoing dialogue in this as well. So let's think about what the 21st century might look like. So the U.S. Census predicts that the world's population will increase from 7 billion that it's now to about 7.9 billion by the year 2020. So we're somewhere between 7 billion and 7.9 billion. We'll get close to 8 billion in a few years. A few years ago, the United Nations Division of Population estimated that the world population would stabilize around 9 billion. But now they've recently revised it and said that it's more likely that it's going to be 10 billion that we max out at, and that our high estimate is that it could be as high as 14 billion. And so there are some regions of the world where they've shown they have not decreased their fertility as much, but they are decreasing their mortality, and so there's still kind of explosive population growth. And in fact, there's some places, some nations in the world, that their population growth is so rapid that they're doubling in size in under 20 years, for example. Okay. So what we expect for the United States is that we're going to continue to experience increasing suburban development with accompanying increases in heavy industry and additional pollution, and that we're going to have to kind of think through how we can encourage U.S. residents to become more energy efficient in their lifestyles and become more directly concerned with how their lifestyle choices are affecting the planet. Right now, it feels as though research is showing that there's a recalcitrance in U.S. citizens from doing that because they feel like nothing they individually can do will have a larger impact. But they're talking about it as in terms of tipping points or thresholds. That if you can get populations to take it on as a personal matter, they might force and require it of industries, right? And so I'm going to talk to you about two political and scientific organizations that have been trying to deal with global climate instability. And I'm sure you've heard of both of them. So we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in 2014, these several thousand scientists who are involved with the project, in 2014, they produced their report. They have an executive summary that I encourage you to look at, as well as hundreds of pages of a report. And that what they argue is that human population growth and economic growth has really finally reached its threshold or tipping point in terms of how carbon emissions are going to affect the environment. And that now that we've reached the tipping point, that we've surpassed like this high point, that we're going to see sudden and irreversible shifts in our environmental quality and in our Earth's sustainability, that they are kind of showing us that we are in the red zone and that we've surpassed any ability to even make a radical, dramatic, or drastic changes for the better. And that what we can expect is that we're going to see mostly negative effects on crops. And so there are going to be more places in the world in which there's droughts, and so crops can't grow. Significant shifting of the environment, so that some places are considerably warmer or considerably colder than they have been before, and so crops, normal crops, wouldn't be able to grow there anymore. And in fact, the biodiversity is shifting. And so there are some trees that are moving ever further north, for example. We're seeing shifts in our environment because of these changes. We're going to see rising temperatures, especially in our oceans, that will have effects on permafrost. Um, uh, and that will end up releasing even more methane gas that has nothing to do with our production of it, industrial processes. We'll have more extreme and more frequent weather events. We're going to have shifting ecosystems, like I gave you a few examples before, and that these costs of climate change are going to be unequally distributed globally. And so countries like Bangladesh, they might see more impacts of even more flooding. African nations are likely to experience even more persistent, chronic periods of drought. Places in the United States will have greater problems with providing water to their populations, and we'll see pockets of extreme distress. The other report I want to talk to you about is from 2 years ago, the COP21 UN Climate Change Conference that happened in Paris. So you may remember that one. It was really particularly controversial. So we have over 200 nations on Earth, and 195 nations agreed that they were going to try to reduce their emissions sufficiently to try to keep rising temperatures below the 2 degrees Celsius mark. They were trying to think through, is there anything we can do to release or to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions? And so they really didn't feel at that time that they could have enforcement, one nation forcing another. And so they were really going to try to move towards a blame and shame model, like calling nations out, reporting how much they're producing. And so they decided that this kind of agreement won't be binding until 55 parties who produce over 55% of the world's greenhouse gases ratify it. And so there's real doubt that it's going to pass because that will require the cooperation of the US and Russia, for example. And it will require the cooperation of China and India, who are actively trying to industrialize, right, and to benefit from industrialization and the consumption of non-renewable resources. And in fact, when you look at China, they have very little resources, natural resources, other than coal. And so they have a strong investment in coal. And you know that President Trump has recently said that he wants absolutely out of this UN climate change ratification process. So we've taken a stand against this. So what are some of the major problems that happened during this conference, thinking through how nations would reach agreement? Well, many developing nations reported that they felt that developed nations they're the ones who are producing the most per capita, per person. And that developing nations are now producing a great amount of global, carbon dioxide emissions just because they have enormous populations, but that they are not producing as much per capita. And so they feel that what the developed world is asking them to do is live at a lower quality of life and a lower standard of living, to not have the same quality of life as people in the industrialized world, so that they don't get to have air conditioning, nice new cars, to be able to use resources as carelessly as we do. And so they argue that if they're supposed to reduce emissions, that the developed nations should pay them a fee for doing it. So for example, Brazil has been just recently more radically cutting down and burning down its resource of the Amazon, right? The Amazon forest, the Amazon jungle. And we know that they consider it a vast resources, but globally we think of it as a resource because it has enormous biodiversity and because it's an enormous stock of green plants that can release oxygen, right? And so Brazil says if you want us to maintain what is left of the Amazon, you should probably pay us, right? So there's those kinds of conflicts going on. And then the other thing is that the United States, who many look to as a world or global leader, is really being an outlier. That they're disagreeing about whether their citizens should have to make any accommodation. And in fact, you realize that if you look at kind of government policy recently, it looks as though the government is even trying to be denying that there is any scientific proof that we have global climate change. And so basically, countries are really struggling over this. And so I'm saying this to you because I hope that you pay attention to newspaper articles on it. You are going to be much more global citizens, and you'll be part of thinking through how do nation states reach agreement about addressing this incredibly complicated global environmental problem. Take care.